Have you ever wondered why one of the most mysterious passages in the entire Bible is also one of the shortest? Just a few verses in Genesis chapter 6 have triggered centuries of debate, fear, speculation, and fascination. A strange group called the Nephilim appears suddenly in the biblical record. The text mentions the sons of God, the daughters of men, and a world so corrupted that judgment was already at the door. And ever since then, readers have asked the same chilling question: were giants really walking the earth before the flood? But the deeper mystery may be even more unsettling than that. Who exactly were the Nephilim? Were they literal giants? Were they the offspring of fallen angels and human women? Were they powerful warrior kings, violent rulers, or symbols of a world descending into chaos? And why does Genesis seem to suggest that whatever happened in those days may have echoed even after the flood? Tonight, we are going deep into one of the darkest and most controversial mysteries in Scripture. We are going to examine what Genesis 6 actually says, what the ancient world believed, why this passage has been interpreted in radically different ways, and whether the Bible truly supports the idea that supernatural beings once walked among mankind before the judgment of Noah's flood. If you enjoy serious biblical mysteries explored with depth and respect, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this video. That simple action helps this project grow and allows us to keep bringing these investigations to life. Now let's step into one of the most debated passages in the Bible. Genesis 6 begins with an unsettling description of humanity multiplying on the face of the earth. Then, suddenly, the narrative turns strange. It says that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, choosing any they wanted. Then comes the line that has haunted readers for generations: the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. That statement raises more questions than it answers. The Hebrew word Nephilim is itself mysterious. Many connect it to the idea of fallen ones. Others believe the word points to great size, extraordinary power, or terrifying reputation. In some ancient translations, the term is rendered as giants, which is why so many readers picture enormous beings roaming the pre-flood world. But the original word is not as simple as that. It carries a shadow of something abnormal, something feared, something remembered, and that matters because Genesis does not introduce the Nephilim as ordinary people. The passage is brief, but its timing is significant. Right before the flood narrative unfolds in full, the Bible gives us this strange episode. Then it immediately moves to God's declaration that human wickedness had become great upon the earth, that every imagination of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. In other words, Genesis 6 presents a world in collapse, a world where boundaries were broken, violence spread, and corruption became universal. So the first key question is this: who were the sons of God? One of the oldest and most dramatic interpretations says these were angelic beings. This view argues that the sons of God in Genesis 6 refers to heavenly beings, similar to how that phrase is used in parts of the Old Testament, especially in Job. According to this reading, certain angels crossed a boundary established by God, took human women, and produced offspring known as the Nephilim. This interpretation became especially influential in ancient Jewish tradition, and it is strongly reflected in the Book of Enoch, an ancient text that, while not part of the biblical canon for most Christian traditions, shaped how many people in the ancient world understood this event. In that tradition, rebellious watchers descended to earth, corrupted humanity, revealed forbidden knowledge, and helped accelerate the moral collapse of civilization. The Nephilim, in that framework, were not just large men. They were unnatural beings tied to rebellion, violence, and the defilement of creation itself. This interpretation is powerful for several reasons. First, it explains why Genesis 6 sounds so unusual. If the passage only referred to normal human marriages, why describe it in such strange and loaded language? Why introduce the mysterious term Nephilim? Why place this episode right before the flood, as though it were part of the reason judgment became necessary? Second, it helps explain why later biblical and Second Temple traditions connect certain rebellious spiritual beings with divine judgment and imprisonment. Many readers see echoes of this idea in passages like 2 Peter and Jude, where some interpreters believe the New Testament alludes to angels who sinned in an extraordinary way, and yet this interpretation also raises serious difficulties. Jesus said that angels in heaven do not marry. Some argue this makes the angelic interpretation impossible. Others respond by saying Genesis 6 is not describing lawful marriage in heaven, but a rebellion in which fallen beings violated the created order. Even so, many theologians remain cautious. The text itself never explicitly says fallen angels had children with human women. That conclusion is inferred, not directly spelled out. This leads to the second major interpretation, the Sethite view. According to this reading, the sons of God were not angels at all, but the godly line of Seth, the son born to Adam and Eve after Abel's death. The daughters of men, in this view, were women from the ungodly line of Cain. The problem then was not angelic intrusion, but spiritual compromise. The righteous line intermarried with the corrupt line, and the result was a rapid spread of evil throughout the world. This interpretation became popular in many Christian traditions because it avoids the difficulties of angels producing physical offspring. It also keeps the emphasis on human sin, which certainly fits the broader context of Genesis 6. The chapter goes on to describe human wickedness, human violence, and human corruption. So for many interpreters, the passage is warning about what happens when those called to live under God's order abandon that calling and become indistinguishable from the world around them. But this view also has weaknesses. The phrase sons of God is not the normal way Genesis identifies the line of Seth, and if the issue is simply intermarriage between believers and unbelievers, why does the text suddenly mention the Nephilim in such an ominous way? Why does the language feel so different from ordinary genealogy or covenant failure? Critics of the Sethite view argue that it makes the passage less strange than it clearly appears to be. Then there is the third major interpretation, one that receives less attention in popular discussions, but deserves serious consideration. Some scholars believe the sons of God refers to powerful rulers, kings, or tyrants, men who exalted themselves like divine beings. In the ancient Near East, kings were often portrayed as semi-divine or uniquely connected to the gods. According to this view, Genesis 6 describes violent elites taking women by force, building dynasties of oppression, and producing legendary warriors remembered for their size, strength, or brutality. In this reading, the Nephilim were not necessarily supernatural hybrids, but notorious men of renown, feared conquerors whose power symbolized the world spiraling into lawlessness. That interpretation fits one important detail very well: the language of domination. The text says they took wives from any they chose. That wording can suggest seizure, not sacred union. It paints a picture of raw power, appetite, and abuse. In that sense, Genesis 6 becomes a portrait of social collapse, where the strong devour the weak and violence fills the earth. Still, the question remains, why were these figures remembered with such dread? Because whether the Nephilim were supernatural hybrids, giant warriors, or tyrannical rulers, the biblical text presents them as part of an age defined by corruption and fear. The world before the flood was not simply sinful in an ordinary sense. It had become distorted, aggressive, and deeply hostile to the order God intended, and this is where the mystery deepens. Genesis 6 says, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward." That final phrase is one of the most puzzling in the entire discussion. What does "and also afterward" mean? Some take it to mean the Nephilim, or at least beings like them, appeared again after the flood. This is why many people connect Genesis 6 to later biblical groups like the Anakim, the Rephaim, and other giant clans mentioned in the Old Testament. When the Israelite spies entered Canaan in Numbers 13, they reported seeing the descendants of Anak and said, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes." They even linked them to the Nephilim, though whether that was a factual identification or terrified exaggeration is heavily debated. Then later, of course, we encounter Goliath, the giant warrior of Gath. So does this mean the Nephilim survived the flood? Not necessarily. Some propose that the phrase "and also afterward" simply means that the same kind of corruption or the same kind of mighty warrior culture re-emerged later. Others speculate that the spies in Numbers used the term Nephilim loosely, as a way of describing terrifyingly large enemies. In other words, later giant traditions may echo the memory of Genesis 6 without proving direct biological continuity, and this is where many sensational theories go too far. The Bible does speak of unusually large warriors and feared clans. It does preserve a memory of the Nephilim, but it does not give us a detailed biological map of giant bloodlines stretching neatly across history. The fascination is understandable, but a serious reading of the text requires restraint. Scripture gives us mystery, but not unlimited license for speculation. So were there literal giants before the flood? Possibly. The biblical and ancient tradition certainly leaves room for that belief. Many sincere readers conclude that the Nephilim were real, unusual beings of immense size and terrifying influence. But the core message of Genesis 6 is bigger than height. The passage is about the collapse of boundaries, the multiplication of wickedness, and the corruption of the human world before divine judgment fell. That is the real atmosphere of the chapter. Something had gone terribly wrong on the earth. Whether you understand the sons of God as fallen angels, the line of Seth, or tyrannical rulers, every major interpretation agrees on one thing. Genesis 6 is describing a world in rebellion against God, a world where power was abused, desire ruled over obedience, and violence spread so deeply that judgment became inevitable. And that may be the most important insight of all. The Nephilim are mysterious, yes. They are fascinating, yes, but in the biblical narrative, they are not there merely to satisfy our curiosity. They are part of a warning. They stand at the edge of the flood story like a shadow over humanity, reminding us that when the created order is defied, chaos follows. This is why the passage still grips readers today, because it feels like a fragment from a forgotten world, a broken memory from before the waters rose, a glimpse into an age so dark that even now, thousands of years later, people still debate what truly happened. Were the Nephilim fallen ones? Giants? Tyrants? Hybrid beings? Legendary warriors whose memory grew with time? The truth is that Genesis 6 gives us enough to be humbled, but not enough to be arrogant, enough to investigate, but not enough to claim certainty where Scripture remains restrained. And perhaps that is exactly the point. The mystery forces us to read carefully, to think deeply, to respect the limits of the text, and above all, to remember that the greatest threat in Genesis 6 is not merely the existence of strange beings, but the full-scale corruption of a world that had turned away from God. So, were giants really walking the earth before the flood? The Bible leaves that possibility open strongly enough that the question cannot be dismissed. But the greater certainty is this: before the flood, the earth was filled with wickedness, violence, and defiance, and the Nephilim became one of the darkest symbols of that fallen age. Now I want to hear from you. Which interpretation do you believe is most convincing? Do you think the Nephilim were fallen angel hybrids, the result of human corruption in Seth's line, or violent rulers remembered as giants and men of renown? Tell me your view in the comments below. And if you enjoy serious, thought-provoking biblical mysteries like this one, subscribe to the channel right now and leave a like on this video. Your support helps this project grow and helps us continue uncovering the most mysterious passages in Scripture. Until the next mystery, keep reading carefully, keep questioning deeply, and keep your eyes on the text.